There's more mischief, mayhem, and nefarious goings-on in the city of brotherly love than Billy Penn could have ever imagined. We've got it all here on the Twisted Philly podcast. True crime, haunted history, the coolest and creepiest places to visit. Welcome to Twisted Philly.
Hey Twisters, what up? Welcome back to Twisted Philly. As you well know by now, I'm your host, Dina Marie. And to the listeners who thought my name was Billy Penn, I absolutely love you. No joke, I seriously love you. I feel like using that as my nickname, or maybe I should start calling myself Billy because I think it's sort of cute when a woman has a man's name. I totally get why some folks thought my name was Billy Penn. Hello, that's the name in my opening clip, and I talk about good old Billy Penn in damn near every episode. So don't beat yourselves up. You can keep on calling me Billy Penn because I will answer to it. This week's What Ups go out to our 5-star reviewers and a few listeners for sporting their Twisted Philly tees on social media. Mike Brown, host of the Pleasing Tires podcast, which many of you know is one of my favorites, and Storm Lightning Bane, one of my friends on Twitter who was our 1100th Twitter follower. Both of them chose the design featuring a quote from yours truly, something I said in episode 8, There Goes the Neighborhood. It was the tale of a man named Roy Kirk and his feud with neighbor Ann Hoover back in the early 90s in Pittsburgh. The feud ended with Roy digging a hole in the foundation of his basement, then digging a tunnel under the floor and up into the living room of Ann Hoover, strangling her, dragging her back through the tunnel and into his basement where he dismembered her body. Of course, when the police walked in, they thought it was a mannequin. And thus a t-shirt is born. Thank you, Mike and Storm, for modeling your shirts. I've got a few more designs up my sleeve, one about Delco witches and hashtag Philly Freaks, spelled with a PH, as has been showing up in the Twisted Philly podcast group, so I think that is deserving of a T as well. What up and thank you to our 5-star reviews. Omar Rajah, who said, hells yes, 5 stars. Omar, you are the first listener to cuss in your review title, and for that, you get a T. So if you hear this, email me at twistedphilly@outlook.com so I can hook you up. What up to D's Boots? Yes, I know Philly was twisted, and I'm so grateful that you listen and really enjoy the show. Lindsay the librarian, thank you so much, Lindsay. What up to JDUBO526, who put emojis in their title, which makes me laugh and smile, and binged Twisted Philly for 3 days. Like, that's crazy that someone likes this show so much they'll spend 3 days listening. Lastly, what up to Jay Goodluck, who found me on podcasts we listened to, and then wasn't sure about listening because of some crazy ex-girlfriends from Philly. Yo, I know Philly girls can be crazy. So thanks for giving me a chance, even though you had a less than stellar experience with some other ladies from the city of brotherly love. So you all know how much I love Philadelphia history. I love our history and history in general. Probably even more than I love the paranormal and true crime, if that's possible. The interesting thing is, sometimes these topics collide and intersect, and that's what I love the most. This week, I had the opportunity to meet a delightful man who owns Philadelphia's oldest continuous operating alehouse in the city. That's McGillin's. If you're not familiar with McGillin's old alehouse, it's on Drury Street between Juniper and 13th. Drury is a tiny little street, and McGillin's is pretty much the only business there. You can't miss it. There's this enormous old-fashioned neon sign on the front of the building, and the building looks very much the way it did almost 160 years ago, although since then the owners have acquired more property on Drury, and it's definitely expanded. McGillin's is an institution in Philadelphia. It's a huge part of our history in the city, and while there may be a few older taverns or alehouses, none have been operating continuously throughout history for as long as McGillin's, and none have quite the history that McGillin's does, nor do they have an impact on the country's perspective of Philly as a beer town. I know that's important to so many Philadelphians and so many listeners. I have a ton of friends who are beer guys or beer girls like Nick and Justin from the Epic Film Guys, my bestie Pricey and her husband, my friends Jackie and Jeremy. McGillin's really puts Philly on the map when it comes to beer. And it's haunted, which makes me so happy. So how did I get connected with Chris Mullen, the owner of McGillin's? Well, it was Irene Levy-Baker, whom I met back in January when I interviewed her about her book, 100 Things to Do in Philadelphia Before You Die. Irene asked if I'd like to meet Chris and talk to him about the history of McGillin's for the show, and of course the hauntings and the great food and beer. I immediately said yes and thank you, so it was Irene who made this episode happen. I met up with Chris Mullen on a Monday at McGillin's. It had rained a little that morning and there were puddles on Drury Street as I walked to the front of the ale house. Some of you saw the video I posted on social media that day. And Chris is an adorable older gentleman with white hair and glasses and a white mustache that doesn't have handlebars, but there's a bit of mischief in his smile, which makes me wonder if he ever would grow a handlebar mustache. Of course, I didn't ask him that question, but I had so many other questions for Chris Mullen. Chris and I headed upstairs to the second floor where it was quieter. There was still some music playing in the background, and we talked about craft beer, McGillin's reputation as one of the premier ale houses in Philadelphia, as well as the country, and the history of this amazing pub. And Irish potato martinis, which, while I seldom drink anything other than wine and an occasional beer, that sounds pretty damn fantastic. So I spent some time on your website, and I was really impressed with the reputation that McGillin's has. So just a couple of standouts, the 155th anniversary of McGillin's was just 2 years ago. That was cited in USA Today. You are ranked one of the 4 coolest bars in the entire United States. That was just a couple of years ago in Gourmet Magazine. You're one of the reasons that CNN named Philly one of the 8 best beer towns in the entire United States. One of the best Irish bars in the U.S. that same year by the Travel Channel. That's a big reputation to uphold. So how do you do it?
We just try to stick true to our roots. When you walk up the street, you see the sign. It says McGillin's Old Ale House. So that's the first thing. We are an ale house. We are beer-centric. We've always been beer-centric. We were the first bar in Philadelphia to embrace craft beer, and especially locally brewed craft beer. And that has been our niche in the marketplaces, is focusing on beer, not the greatest beers in the world, not the greatest beers in the United States, but the best beers from our local region.
So it's really local, a real focus on Philly. Is it southeastern PA? Is it the tri-state area?
No, it's the tri-state.
Okay.
And we'll extend up into New York, get down into Maryland, Virginia. So just we try to stay within 100 miles of the Philadelphia area.
You talk so much about beer, and I was reading about some of the history of the pub, the impact that Prohibition had on McGillin's, and it seemed like that was the first time that they'd ever served food because, alcohol was prohibited.
Right. This was a straight ahead bar,
okay,
saloon kind of place. If they had food, and the origin of that is a little bit muddled, but I'm presuming what I've heard is Mom McGillin used to roast potatoes on the fireplace and give them out to her customers. But when Prohibition came, obviously they had to do something to keep running, and that's what they did. They embraced food.
Okay, so Chris, you mentioned potatoes. There was something that really struck me. What is an Irish potato martini?
It has...
because the word beer isn't anywhere in that.
No, it has coconut and cream and vanilla vodka.
Okay. So. Craft beers and history. Could there be a better combination anywhere? I love that McGillin's has been a family-owned business forever. And in all of that time, there's only been 2 different families tied to the ownership. Certainly different generations within each family, for sure, but there's something to be said for maintaining a legacy like that. I wanted to hear from Chris about Ma and Pa McGillin, the couple who opened this ale house with their family back in 1860, which, mind you, was the same year Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Yeah, that was a long time ago. So what was the name before McGillin's? Because I think, was it
Bell
1910?
The Bell in Hand Tavern.
Bell in Hand Tavern.
Right. What happened, again, this is the next part of our roots. It's McGillin's Old Ale House. So McGillin, everybody would say, we're going to McGillin's to see, we're going to go see Bill McGillin, we're going to see Pa McGillin, we're going to see Mom McGillin. So they said, to heck with it. They changed the name to McGillin's.
Okay, so that was the surname of the original owners.
Yes, William McGillin.
And the pub opened in 1860, so there was really nothing else that old here.
Right. I'm sure there were a lot of other bars in Philadelphia.
Right.
Clearly, taverns, etc. I mean, this is an old city. The city moved west from the river.
Yeah.
So we were at the forefront of that. Pa was wise enough to purchase this property, and literally the city grew up around the bar.
Has the property always maintained this entire space, like as large as it is, the 2 floors?
Okay, well, when you walk in, if you walk up to the front of McGillin's and you look straight on to the front of McGillin's, there's actually 3 pieces of real estate.
Okay.
And the original McGillin's was in the middle, and facing the front of McGillin's to the right was an oyster house, and to the left, McGillin's had his home, and he raised his family, 13 children. Pretty small space.
I would imagine so.
And he was a busy man, both day and night, so he kept busy.
Between the family and the pub.
Yeah.
13 kids. 13 flipping kids. Could you imagine? I know one person who can imagine, and that's a friend of mine who is the second youngest of 16 children. 13 children in that one building on Drury Street, which wasn't as big as it is today. It was 2 floors, the ale house on the first floor, and all 13 children, plus Ma and Pa McGillin on the second floor. In that very spot where Chris and I sat with our ice water and my microphone. I looked around while Chris told me that story, and I tried to imagine 13 beds, or maybe 7 beds with 2 occupants in each, plus space for Ma and Pa, 15 people sharing that room, and it's incredible. We live in houses today that could probably hold 2, maybe even 3 times the people who inhabit them, and we feel like we're running out of space. And yet we're not running an alehouse there at the same time. In 1901, Bill McGillin passed away, and an unlikely business person took over running the alehouse. His wife, Catherine, took over the pub.
Yes.
Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. It's his
Okay.
second wife, Catherine McGillin. His first wife had passed at some point, and so this was a younger, new wife that he had, and I believe it was about half and half of the children were from the first wife and half of the second.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So that's how she was able to survive so much longer into the end of Prohibition.
Okay.
So she did take over, and she ran this bar.
So that must have been a really unusual experience, because when you think about the period of Prohibition, and before that, I can't even imagine women were allowed in bars in that time of our country.
Yes, exactly.
Was it just because through inheritance or estate she was able to run it, or?
You know, I don't know the legal ramifications of it, but clearly because she inherited the bar, she was the owner by the laws of inheritance, and she ran it. She's a tough woman. She managed to hold her end of the bargain.
I saw some stories about her being not just tough, but really beloved in the city of Philadelphia.
Yes.
Can you tell me anything about that?
I'll tell you, people would come out on her birthday. She used to give out carnations on her birthday. When she died, it was one of the largest funerals ever for a woman in Philadelphia at that point in time.
Wow.
So I understand hundreds, if not thousands of people came to her funeral.
Catherine McGillin was a formidable woman. She was loved by the city of Philadelphia, so think about it. She's raising 13 children without her husband, some theirs, some his. Her husband passed away at the turn of the century, and now she's running an alehouse, one of the busiest and most popular bars in the city. Philadelphians loved her and her husband so much, Ma and Pa McGillin, they never used the name of the tavern, which, as Chris mentioned, was called Bell in Hand. They called it McGillin's. It wasn't until 1910 that the name was officially changed, 9 years after Pa's passing. People celebrated the end of the Civil War at McGillin's. They continued hanging at McGillin's even during Prohibition, a time when so many other taverns closed their doors, which makes me wonder, was there anything else Catherine McGillin was serving out of the kitchen besides potatoes and eventually cheesesteaks and ice cream? Could she have been sneaking in a little whiskey? Or was it simply that everyone just loved McGillin's, and they loved her? Now, Chris mentioned her funeral and the carnations, and when she died in 1937, Broad Street was shut down for her funeral. One of the busiest streets in our city was shut down for her funeral procession. While McGillin's may have been opened by Bill McGillin, it was his wife, Catherine, who kept that legacy going. And she did it in a way that made the city fall completely head over heels in love with her. So how did Chris Mullin and his family come into the picture? I mentioned the bar has been owned by just 2 families, although multiple generations within each of those families. The McGillins were the first. When Ma McGillin passed away, her daughter Mercedes McGillin Hooper ran the alehouse for over 20 years. Yeah, another strong woman in the McGillin clan. I love that. I'll let Chris tell you how he and his wife Mary Ellen came to be the proprietors of McGillin's for almost 25 years. We're going to talk a little bit about his experiences there and some impressive guests. So how did you and your wife and your family get involved in McGillin's?
Well, the McGillins, when Ma passed, she did survive Prohibition and managed to reopen the bar after Prohibition, but died a couple of years later. Her daughter Mercedes took it over, Mercedes McGillin, later Mercedes McGillin Hooper, and she and her son ran it until 1958. And then in 1958, Joe Shaponiak and Henry Spaniak, 2 brothers, bought it from the McGillin family. And then my wife and I purchased it from the 2 brothers in 1993.
Are there any members of your family? I thought I read something about your son.
My son is here as well. He's essentially he's running the place. He's I would classify him as general manager. My wife is here right as we speak. She's in the basement cooking. She comes in 3 days a week and does a lot of the cooking. And I'm here 5 days. But Chris is here running the place most days. He's in charge.
So the tradition of really maintaining this as a family-owned and operated business is very much alive with you and your family.
Yes.
Well, I know you just probably had big celebrations for St. Patrick's Day. How busy does this place get around that time of year?
We have thousands of people come through here on St. Patrick's Day. And also New Year's Day.
Okay.
It's also another huge day here. So actually, New Year's Day is almost larger, or is larger many times than St. Patrick's Day.
Okay.
Close to 3,000 people went through here on St. Patrick's Day.
So you've had some pretty famous guests come here to McGillin's. I mean, it's an institution in Philadelphia. Tennessee Williams, a long time ago. Joe Biden, a little more recently. Who are some of your favorites that have come through?
The Marx Brothers.
Oh, wow.
W.C. Fields. The Barrymores, not the latest Barrymore.
John Barrymore.
John and Ethel Barrymore were frequented the place. This used to be the nexus of the theatrical district of Philadelphia, and there was a theater right around the corner called the Garrett Theater, and those famous folks would come in here before the shows, after the shows, even during intermission. They'd imbibe come in the back door from the theater, and people always said the second half of the show is always better than the first, and I think we had something to do with that.
They had a few cocktails.
Possibly.
I had no idea that there was, obviously Broad Street's right just a few blocks away with the Wilma and the Arden and everything.
Of course, all newer theaters, but on Chestnut Street. And of course, the Walnut Street Theater is the oldest theater in the United States.
Yes.
Still in existence. And but the Garrick is right around the corner.
And the Prince is right up the street, so that's not too far.
Yep. There are remnants of all kinds of theaters along Chestnut.
Now, McGillin's is first and foremost an alehouse. That was one of the very first things that Chris said to me, that they've stayed true to their roots. They've got amazing craft beers, great food, good times, day and night. I wanted to talk with Chris about a few of my favorite parts of McGillin and give him the chance to talk about what he loves about this alehouse, into which he and his family invest so much love, not only for McGillin's, but for Philadelphia. I started by asking him what he would want all of you to know, what's important to him and important to McGillin's, and there's quite a bit. How did you start the collection of old Philadelphia signage?
Well, I guess I'd have to say the first sign that was given to us by John Connors from Brickstone Real Estate when they were developing the Wanamaker building, gave us one of those signs, and from there it just flowed.
For me, it's one of the most charming things about the space because it brings back so many memories of childhood and holiday shopping downtown with parents and grandparents, and to see Wanamakers and the old soda fountain counter at Woolworths. It's such a nice touch.
Litz and Gimbels, and more recently we have Lebec Fenn is up there. And
I saw that.
Warwick, the hotel that was given to us as well. So.
I mean, they're Philadelphia institutions, and it's nice to see them on your wall.
There's so much. I had to hesitate for a minute.
Well, lay it on me, Chris.
I would say that we're family friendly. Definitely late at night, it's young people and it's a straight ahead drinking place. But during the day, we have folks of all ages, from infants up to seniors coming in. Mm-hmm. And as the night goes on, it becomes very young. Yeah. And I discourage people from bringing their children. But in the early part of the evening and weekdays and weekends, on the weekend, we get families of all ages. So that's a fun part. Previously, we were busy at lunch, very busy at lunch. People used to eat out a lot more at lunch. And lately, the trend is not. They eat at their desks, they go work out, they do some shopping. So you don't get as many business people. But now, Philadelphia has become a 24-hour city, and tourism has become a big part of our economy. So you have people coming in for the historic sites. They'll bring their family in, or coming in for conventions and that type of thing.
Okay, now this wouldn't be complete unless we talked about beer and food and what you are going to taste and enjoy when you visit McGillin's. I had no idea that McGillin's has their own craft brews, and they're made by a local brewery right here in Pennsylvania. Talk about keeping it local and supporting Pennsylvania and Philadelphia businesses. What beer do you recommend? If you were to pick a couple of beers, what would you recommend for somebody new?
The McGillin's ales are great. We have a McGillin's IPA, which is our newest beer. It was in commemoration of our 150th anniversary. And it was brewed. We got a panel of local beer writers and aficionados to get together and taste various renditions, and that was a result of that. So that's a great one. This McGillin's 1860 IPA. It's also available in bottles if you're fortunate enough to be near a distributor that carries it. And then we have McGillin's Real Ale, McGillin's lager, genuine lager. The Real Ale is English-style ale, similar to a Bass, and the McGillin's Lager is a German-style lager. They're all made by Stouts Brewery out in Adamstown, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, I know where that is.
They're made for us.
All right, so McGillin's IPA, the 1860 IPA for the 150th anniversary, and then the McGillin's Ale, which would be comparable to a Bass Ale.
Yes.
And the McGillin's Stout?
Lager.
Lager,
genuine lager.
Sorry.
Genuine lager.
I don't drink beer that often, but like summertime, really cold, something light. I tend to go for the lighter ones, not so much.
The lager would fit that category, but our IPA is not a typical IPA because it's made with American hops.
Okay.
So it's not as powerful. It's not one of these 8 or 9% alcohol beers. It's got a citrusy flavor to it. We're noted for comfort food. So shepherd's pie is real good. We have a Mile High meatloaf.
What's Mile High meatloaf?
It's layered with mashed potatoes and slices of meatloaf, and then topped with an onion ring. So that's great.
Wow.
We have fish and chips, mostly on Fridays and Saturdays. And our wings are Philadelphia famous, and some people say world famous, but they're large, great wings. But our burger's great too.
And you said your wife, actually right now while we're chatting, your wife's in the basement cooking.
Yeah.
So is she one of the chefs? Is she like a head chef?
She's more or less like the head chef. She does a lot of the soups and the preparation, sauces, tries to influence the specials. We have 2 full-time chefs.
Okay.
Each of whom, so I always have one on premise, and they're in charge of the kitchen.
Was that Irish potato martini her idea?
I don't know. I'm not going to say.
I'm so captivated by
I would
that.
hate to step on someone's toes. It was one of our managers or my son. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not much of a martini drinker, but when I see names and flavors like that, it's just so enticing.
Well, we do them for every season. Like right now, we have a Philly teeny, and then next week is the ESPN draft. The NFL draft has come to town. So we're going to have the Eagle teeny. We'll bring that back. We usually just do that during the.
Eagle teeny?
Please don't ask me what's in it.
I won't.
I won't. I'm
is
not
it
behind
green?
the bar enough. It's green, yes. Yes.
So anybody that wants to celebrate the draft, whether you're excited about what's happening or you're miserable about what's happening.
Oh, no, it'll be good.
This will be a good place to come.
Yes.
Get some great food and try the Eagle teeny. I think that sounds fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, Mile High meatloaf. Now, you guys know I don't eat meat. I don't eat beef and pork. I eat chicken and fish, but that sounds pretty amazing, and I'm definitely going to take my daughter down to check that out because she is a huge meatloaf fan. It will for sure just be the fish and chips for me. I know a couple of guys that would probably tear up that Mile High meatloaf.
Yes.
I shouldn't just say guys because my kid is a huge meatloaf fan. She would tear that up.
It's great.
And, I'm glad you mentioned it's family friendly because I hadn't thought about, bringing mine. And she's a teenager, but I just hadn't thought about bringing her, and I really should.
Great. It's fun. They enjoy it. people call and say, "Are you guys family friendly?" And I said, the only difference between a 5-year-old and a 21-year-old, when the 5-year-old has to vomit, they know how to find the bathroom. The 21-year-old can never find the bathroom in time, but they both are the same. They fall off their chairs, they spill things.
Throw a little bit of a tantrum sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes there's tantrums.
I'm leaving that in if you're okay with it.
That's
I
fine.
think that's brilliant.
That's fine.
And that line about a 5-year-old versus a drunk 21-year-old, that has got to be one of the funniest lines I've ever heard. I remember what happened on my 21st birthday. My boyfriend and my best friend at the time brought me home, practically poured me out of the car, and I landed on my parents' front lawn vomiting. Yeah, you'd think that they would have cut me off at some point, but they didn't. So, Chris, you are correct when you say the primary difference between a 5-year-old versus a 21-year-old who's been drinking is one of them can find the bathroom and the other one can't, because I sure as hell proved that many years ago. I mentioned early on in this episode that McGillin's is haunted, so you're probably wondering, when am I going to ask Chris about the ghosts? Well, I didn't want to start out asking about the ghost of Ma McGillin. He'd think I was a ghost freak, which, well, you all know I'm a ghost freak. But of course I asked him about the legend of Ma McGillin haunting the alehouse. You know, one of the stories that people always talk about is that McGillin's is possibly haunted with the ghost of Catherine McGillin, Ma McGillin, who ran this pub for many years.
Right.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, we've had several of the paranormal societies come in here and stay overnight and take photos and pictures, and they have all kinds of sensors. And they have attested to the fact that there are spirits here in this building. You mentioned Ma McGillin, and that's one of the more prominent ones. But actually, one of the paranormal societies sensed a presence of Pa McGillin in almost the exact spot where he died, because he died on premises, or he had a heart attack on premises.
He passed away in the basement, I think?
Yeah, he was installing a heating system. We were one of the first bars in the city to have air conditioning, and we may have been one of the first places to have a central heating system. So he was probably doing the work himself. Sometimes men of a certain age have a hard time backing off, and he probably overexerted himself, and the rest is history.
Wow.
And then in this room where we're sitting right now, people have felt a presence at the front end of this bar. Ma McGillin celebrated her 85th birthday up in this room here. So it could be Ma's spirit as well.
Have any of the employees had experiences or seen things?
They have mentioned strange stuff, like things falling from shelves inexplicably, after hours when there's nobody around and no reason for it.
Yeah.
They've had instances of the TVs turning on and off. Ma is, very disheartened to see us having so many TVs in here.
Okay.
But it's part of what we
She's
do
a bit
right
of a
now.
traditionalist,
Yes.
I guess.
She would like to limit it to conversation, I'm sure.
I didn't realize that there were paranormal investigations.
Yes.
Was that, in recent years?
Within the last 10 years, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about opening something like that up to your patrons?
In what regard?
Like hosting a paranormal night for...
It's never occurred to us. No.
Hosting a show called Twisted Philly, those kinds of things cross my mind all the time.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the strange and unusual.
Yes.
For sure. Okay, if McGillin's ever holds a public seance, I just want to go on record as saying I may have given Chris Mullen that idea. Chris and I chatted for a little while longer, even after I stopped recording. I remarked about the beautiful bar on the second floor and the architecture of the building. We talked for a while about our mutual acquaintance, Irene Levy Baker, and the PR company she owns, which works with Chris and the team at McGillin's. We talked about Stout's Brewery, the company that brews McGillin's craft beers. I really enjoyed my time with Chris so much, and I know when you go to McGillin's, you're going to enjoy your time there too. Take a walk around the first floor and see how many signs you can find from old Philadelphia businesses. Or better yet, see if you can find every liquor license dating back to the late 1800s. The only years that are missing are those during Prohibition between 1920 and 1933. And if you sit upstairs, look over at the corner in the front of the building between the bar and the window to see if Ma McGillin is lurking there, ready to turn off the television. Be sure to try that mile-high meatloaf. If you're there around the draft, take a sip on an Eagletini. And I'm looking forward to McGillin's Lager this summer. McGillin's is open 7 days a week except for major holidays from 11 a.m. to 2 a.m. There's family-friendly during the day, more of a drinking crowd at night, so if you're heading to McGillin's after dinner, be sure to get a sitter for the little twisters. I can't thank Chris Mullen enough for the time he spent with me and bearing with me through all of the questions I threw at him. And I must again thank Irene for making the introduction. You can find out more about McGillin's on their website at mcgillins.com. That's McGillins.com. And if you want to grab a copy of 100 Things to Do in Philly Before You Die, which McGillin's is in that book, you can order one on Irene's website at 100thingstodoinphiladelphia.com. And don't forget, if you mention in the comments you heard about her book on Twisted Philly, Irene will even autograph it for you. As always, thank you so much for listening. That's it from me. Ciao for now, Twisters.